Hi students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 3, Biological Diversity. This is video number 10 and we're going to be looking at life on Earth. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, trying to cover all of life on Earth in one video is going to be a little bit challenging, so I'm not going to try and do that. But what we are going to try and do is to explain biological diversity, or at least aspects of biological diversity, within the theory of evolution by natural selection. And to do that, we're going to examine some of the changes in diversification of life since it first appeared on the Earth. So this is a big topic, and obviously we can't cover it all in a single video. So we're just going to try and hit a few little important points and then cover more of these during class time. So here are the 6 stages of evolution, and this includes both chemical and biological evolution. And it's probably just a context at this stage, not something we want to go into in a lot of detail. So obviously what we want to do first is we want to try and get organic molecules from inorganic molecules. And when you look at the experiments of Urey and Miller, you notice that they have been able to, in some ways, try and replicate the early Earth atmosphere and how that may have led to the formation of organic molecules. From the organic molecules, we then looked at the membrane structure in our first module. That was a structure which had a bilipid layer, which was interspersed with proteins that were either channel proteins moving materials from across the membrane, or they were also structural proteins to try and maintain the integrity of the membrane. So this had to happen next. There had to be some sort of way of containing certain types of chemicals in a small place or a little bag, rather than having them just all scattered around everywhere. Of course, once we could have a little container, then we went on to the production, or at least the first prokaryotic cells. And I might just darken that pen a little bit because it's a little bit difficult to see at the moment. So prokaryotic cells were the next important group, and this is where we went from chemical to biological. So this is where life actually began. If you want to, the way we've defined life, this is the way it began. In fact, these lovely little structures here are stromatolites, and they are formed by cyanobacteria. So they are among the oldest types of fossils that we know of. Eukaryotic cells came after the prokaryotic cells. We think some level of endosymbiosis may have occurred, and again we looked at the relationship between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, and then the further categories that we look at after that, as how these cells may have come to be, how they may have evolved, and how we went from the simple cells to the more complex cells, to groups of cells, to specialized cells. And that's really our sequence as we go through looking at the 6 stages of evolution, to start from the chemical basis through to the most complex molecular basis. So how do we know some of this stuff? Well, we know some of this stuff because of obviously the diversity of life that exists today, and we do look at all of the different types of life forms. We've got classification systems that help us to link different groups together. We also have a lot of evidence now from genetics, from the analysis of biochemicals, that tells us a little bit more about some of the relationships between different organisms. But in terms of life in the past, what we have are fossils. And fossils come in a range of different types. They can be whole organisms, such as insects in amber, I guess made most famous in Jurassic Park. And certainly the fictional aspect, the science fictional aspect of Jurassic Park was something that we did look at for science. And you find so often there is a relationship between what is perceived or thought about in terms of science fiction, and then what we can actually catch up with in terms of the science. It's that genius, it's that creativity, it's that curiosity that's so important to the process of science moving forward. So whole organisms are one type of fossil. Hard parts are the most common types of remnants of living things that fossilize, so bones or shells we find more often preserved as fossils. Sometimes we find impressions. Impressions can be a mold, so an imprint of something, or it can also be a cast, and often the cast can relate to things like petrification. So this is the process where other minerals might come in and fill those spaces. So you get something that looks like a living organism, but is actually a rock, is made of minerals. So molds and casts also give us a little bit of an idea, and these are particularly important for soft-bodied organisms that don't have hard parts to fossilize. And we can even find things like footprints or coprolites, which is fossilized dung, that tells us something about the diets, obviously, of the particular organisms, but aren't the organisms themselves. So we can look at footprints, for example, and get a little bit of a sense of how tall an animal might have been, from its stride length, from the size of the footprints, whether there were large and small animals of the same type together, whether they were individuals, and there's a few quite famous footprints sites around. So these are all the different types of ways in which living organisms can be fossilized. But that doesn't really tell us much about the diversity of life. That just tells us the ways we might be able to find them. So let's have a look at the history of life in a little more detail. So here's a table. So this is a very comprehensive table. Well, it really isn't, but it's more about trying to find where in the history of life each of these different groups is first found. So we obviously do find some examples of reptiles or mammals in younger rocks than 200 million years, but none before. So it gives us a little bit of a general time scale or time frames in which to work with each of these different significant events in the history of life on Earth. The thing that we do notice as a general pattern, as we go from older to younger, we find the organisms going from the simple, or the simpler, shall we say, to the more complex. Okay, so when we were looking at that history of life before, and we were saying we start with organic molecular formation, we start with structures that contain different types of chemicals, we end up with a very basic kind of a cell that then becomes more complex as we go through each of these different groups as well. This is what we find when we look at the fossil record. We find a lot of the older rocks, a lot of the fossils that are found in the older rocks are of simpler organisms, and the more complex ones are the ones that are found in the most recent rocks. So I think it's one of the things that's important is that we have a bit of a general overview of each of these important groups, and also look at some of the relationships between when different types of plants first appeared in the fossil record and the different types of animals that have relationships with those plants that also appeared in the fossil record. And so as we track through each of these, also important as we track through things like the all of the different vertebrate groups, for example, from fish to amphibians to reptiles and then to birds and mammals, which did appear at a similar sort of a time, that we see this kind of progression, the way that we explain evolution through complexity, through increased complexity. So again, not important for you to try and memorize all of these dates or all of these particular events, but it's important that you have a good understanding of this, of the general sequence, and of course these ideas of older rocks containing the more simpler organisms and younger rocks containing the more complex. Now that doesn't occur always, and we do use things like stratigraphic correlation to compare fossils in different places. It's one of the things that we've done when we've looked at things like the Gondwanan distribution. We've said that there are rocks that have been found in different continents. They seem to be the same rock type. They seem to have the same types of fossils in them. So it suggests that they were all laid down at a similar time period, but that It's interesting because they may contain organisms like plants that don't have any way of getting from one continent to another, which suggests that these continents must have been much closer together than they were today. We also use, as the way that I've drawn, the principle of superposition, which basically suggests that the higher up a column you go, the younger the rocks are. So rocks can be folded, but generally speaking, these rules hold true. And we can look at stratigraphic correlation. We can also look at biostratigraphy. So we can compare rock types or the sequence of rocks and look at two areas as being correlated. We can also look at the fossils that we find in those rocks and also seeing some correlation between them. So it's probably useful then to try and start to link these things together. And these are exercises that you'll need to do in class to put together what you just saw from the last table, which is the order of different organisms and when they appear in the fossil record, or at least different groups of organisms and when they appear in the fossil record, and the geological time scale itself. So you can see that the whole of geological time, the 4.5 billion years that we've had on the planet, or that the planet has had, not that we've had, but the planet has been characterized by large periods of not very much activity or very simple organisms, and then a burst of life that's occurred really through the Cambrian explosion. And that's one of the ones that we'll look at in a little bit more detail. There's some really fabulous fossil sites around the world that have given us a huge amount of information about particular time periods. And obviously the age of the dinosaurs is one of the ones that most people know probably better than any others. Of course, once we find fossils, we rarely find whole organisms. Mostly what we find are traces, some fragments, bones, shells, that we have to then put together a story about. And the way we put those stories together is we look at modern species and we compare modern species with fossil finds and try and put together a story based on the similarities that we see. And that can be everything from the way muscles attach to bone or the way muscles attach to shells, to the shapes, to the size, and some interpretations that we placed on what those particular structures might have been used for. So the shape and the type and the number of different types of teeth in the jaw, for example, the length of the leg bones or the arm bones, which might be foreleg bones, to sort of get a sense of whether this was supporting a very large weight, a very tall animal, a very fast-moving animal, or whether it was capable of flight by looking at the structure cross-section of the bones, if we can get to that sort of detail. And sometimes the preservation is outstanding, and we've got some fabulous fossil finds around the world, but not always. The one thing we do have, which was an interesting comment that Darwin made, and one we'll explore a little bit later on, was his concern about the lack of transition forms. And he knew that the whole premise behind natural selection as a mechanism for evolution was that there was this gradual change from one group of organisms radiating into perhaps two different groups or going down two different pathways. And that suggests a lot of transitions. And we don't find a lot of transitions in the fossil record. And there's a couple of different stories that go with that, which we will explore later on, including punctuated equilibrium. But we have, as we've discovered more fossil sites, as we've been able to interpret more information that we've got from fossils, found a few more of these intermediates or transition fossils. And of course, the most famous one we will have a look at in a little more detail is Archaeopteryx, but it's by no means the only one. There are a number of different transition fossils that we will have a look at, but those we'll have to look at in class in a little bit more detail. So this has just been hopefully an introduction to get you thinking about the fossil record and the importance of linking those ideas that we've been learning about in natural selection with the evidence that we collect from the fossil record. Thanks for watching.